There are breakup stories, there are wedding stories, and then there is the kind of emotional car crash that happens when your 6-year relationship dies on the very day you're supposed to say, I do, and that's exactly where Dinikahi Setelah Putus decides to start, with a choice that feels almost cruel in its honesty, almost too raw to watch, and yet somehow impossible to look away from. Because from the very first frame you can feel that this isn't just another fluffy romantic drama, this is a story about what happens when the fairy tale collapses and life, in all its ridiculous chaos, hands you a new script you never auditioned for, marrying a stranger to heal the wound of a love that didn't survive the finish line. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, Dinikahi Setelah Putus, a 2025 Indonesian romantic drama with streaks of corporate thriller and family melodrama, takes that insane premise and treats it with a surprising amount of empathy, style, and emotional intelligence, and as I was watching it, I kept thinking, this is exactly the kind of story that understands how heartbreak actually feels in the age of Instagram weddings and LinkedIn careers, where image and reality never quite line up. On the surface, we get the glossy shots of banquet halls and skyscrapers, the curated perfection of vows and white dresses and power suits, but underneath that, the film keeps drilling into this one question: what if the worst day of your life is also the beginning of something you never knew you needed? The movie introduces us to Luigi in a way that feels so painfully specific. He could be any of us who have stayed a little too long in a comfortable relationship because it seemed like the logical next step, because 6 years must mean forever, right? And the way the opening is framed is just brutal in its simplicity. We see the wedding preparations, the nervous laughter with friends, the close-ups of the ring box, the slow motion of guests taking selfies in their batik and dresses, and the camera keeps cutting back to Luigi's face, that anxious smile that's trying so hard to be calm, and you can already sense something is not right. There's a slight tremor in his voice, a flicker in his eyes, and then the film pulls the rug out from under him in the most humiliating way possible. His girlfriend of 6 years, the woman he has emotionally invested practically his entire 20s into, doesn't just get cold feet, she calls it off on the day, in the venue, with the guests waiting, and the way the director chooses to show that moment is key to understanding the vibe of this entire film. It's not played as a soap opera meltdown with over-the-top screaming, it's almost quiet, suffocatingly quiet. You hear the hum of the air conditioning, the far-off muffled laughter from the ballroom, and then this low, controlled voice of someone who has clearly rehearsed this speech in her head, saying she can't do it, that somewhere along the way she lost herself, that the idea of life with Luigi began to feel more like a duty than a dream, and you watch his face fall not in some dramatic slow-motion collapse, but in that microsecond where the future you had mentally decorated just evaporates, and you are left with confetti and flower arrangements and no bride. That opening works so strongly because so many of us understand what it's like to build an identity around being someone's partner, to imagine the rest of your life as an extension of a relationship, and then, suddenly, have that rug yanked away, and the film doesn't immediately cut to the next major plot point. It lets Luigi sit in that emptiness, literally and metaphorically. There's a sequence where he wanders through the now empty reception hall, picking up a wilted flower from a table left half set, the staff quietly packing away what could have been the best night of his life, and the camera just follows him in this long, almost uncomfortable shot, as if daring us to inhabit that loneliness with him. What I really appreciate about Dinikahi Setelah Putus is that it doesn't treat this heartbreak as a mere plot device to fast forward us into the marry a stranger gimmick. It actually allows Luigi's pain to breathe, and that makes the next step in his journey feel less like a wild K-drama twist and more like a desperate, oddly believable human reaction. Because when he meets Sarah, it's not in some cliché slow-motion meet-cute where the world stops and violins start playing. He meets her at what is basically rock bottom, when he's sitting alone somewhere in the city, maybe in a small coffee shop he used to share with his ex, maybe in a corporate building corridor where he just received a politely worded email asking about the cancellation of the wedding venue, and everything about him screams, man who has just been emotionally bulldozed. Sarah walks into his world not as a manic dream girl sent to fix him, but as a self-contained hurricane, a director, a woman who clearly runs on deadlines and coffee, used to making decisions in 0 seconds flat, the kind of person who doesn't have time for slow, hesitant conversations because her entire life is a back-to-back meeting schedule. On paper, their meeting and what follows might sound insane. She suddenly offers this nobody, or at least who we think is a nobody at this point, a chance to marry her, and not in a few months, but immediately, in a marriage of convenience, a contract, a fast-track arrangement that would make most of us run for the exit. But the film, to its credit, spends time planting emotional and practical reasons that make this proposal not exactly logical, but emotionally coherent. We start to realize Sarah is under her own kind of pressure. As a director in a major company, or maybe as the head of a successful creative firm, she's facing constant scrutiny, questions about her personal life, subtle digs from colleagues and maybe even from her own parents about when she's going to settle down, the classic double standard that women in power still have to deal with, where professional success is never enough unless it's accompanied by a ring on the finger. There are hints of an impending corporate deal, or a family condition, where being married would smooth things politically, and in Luigi she sees not a romantic soulmate at first, but a solution, someone who is clearly heartbroken enough to be open to something crazy, someone who isn't trying to climb socially through her status, someone who, on that day, has nothing left to lose. When she proposes this lightning marriage, the scene is written in a way that balances absurdity and genuine emotion. Luigi looks at her like she's lost her mind, and honestly, who wouldn't? But the way she lays everything out, blunt and straightforward, no fake sweetness, just this hard honesty of an exhausted woman who is tired of playing the game alone, that hits differently. She's basically saying, look, I don't believe in fairy tales either. I'm not promising you love, but I'm promising you stability, an agreement, a new chapter that might hurt less than staying stuck in the wreckage of your almost wedding. And Luigi's acceptance isn't instant, because it shouldn't be, and the movie does a good job of showing his hesitation, the way he's torn between the shame of being the guy who got dumped at the altar, and the fear of jumping into an arrangement that could become another disaster. But when he finally says yes, it's not triumphant, it's almost quiet, worn out, like someone who's too tired to keep fighting what feels like the inevitable tide of his life changing. This is where the film could have easily drifted into pure romantic comedy territory, using the enormous clash between Luigi's gentle, emotionally wounded personality and Sarah's sharp, no-nonsense directorial style for cheap laughs, and to be fair, it does give us those moments of comedic relief, the awkward first night in their fancy new condo, the way Luigi tries to figure out the unspoken rules of Sarah's precise lifestyle, the conversations that sound more like business meetings than pillow talk, but at its core, the story is far more interested in what it means to build a relationship backwards, commitment first, feelings maybe later. And then, just when you start settling into this odd but strangely compelling dynamic of married strangers learning to coexist, Dinikahi Setelah Putus pulls out its second major twist. Luigi is not just some random heartbroken guy, he is, in fact, the son of a conglomerate, an heir to a gigantic business empire, a world he has tried to distance himself from or maybe was pushed out of. And with this revelation, the film transforms, not completely, but significantly, from a personal romance drama into a saga of power, legacy, and family betrayal. The reveal itself is handled with a nice bit of irony. Sarah, the accomplished director used to reading people and situations, thinks she's pulled off this clever arrangement with an ordinary guy who has no stakes, someone safe and simple, only to discover she has unintentionally married into a family dynasty that makes her own corporate battlefield look like a playground. The moment she finds out, maybe through a news article that surfaces, maybe when a black car appears in front of their house and a finely dressed older man steps out, is played with a mixture of disbelief and anger, and more importantly, it forces her and Luigi to confront something they have both been able to avoid so far. Their pasts are not truly behind them, they are just waiting at the doorstep, ready to crash this fragile little marriage they've built. Luigi's half-brother enters the story like a storm cloud, bringing with him all the unresolved tension of a fragmented family, jealousy, competition, resentment that has been simmering for years. The film doesn't paint him as a cartoon villain, instead, he's given real motivations. Maybe he's the one who stayed and did all the work in the family business while Luigi ran away. Maybe he feels overlooked or feels like Luigi is the golden child who rejected the throne, and now that Luigi is back, whether he likes it or not, the power balance is shifting. What this does to the tone of the film is fascinating. Suddenly, every domestic scene between Luigi and Sarah is charged not just with romantic or emotional subtext, but with political consequences. Their living room becomes a war room, their marriage bed sits on top of a minefield of corporate succession. Luigi is dragged back into a world of boardrooms, shareholders, and strategic alliances, and Sarah, who thought she was the more powerful one in this arrangement, finds herself having to recalibrate, because now she's both a partner and a pawn in a game she didn't sign up for. This is where the movie's pacing really starts to show its ambition. Some viewers might feel the shift from intimate heartbreak story to sprawling family corporate drama is a bit jarring, but if you stick with it, you start to see the thematic thread tying everything together, at every level, from romance to business. It's about control, who gets to define your fate, who sits at the head of the table, whether it's the reception table at your wedding or the boardroom table of a conglomerate. The cinematography supports this shift beautifully. In the early part of the film, the camera stays close to Luigi, shallow depth of field, blurred backgrounds mirroring his emotional tunnel vision, but when the conglomerate plotline kicks in, the frame opens up, we get wide shots of glass towers in Jakarta's skyline, sterile boardrooms with glossy surfaces where every reflection seems to hide a secret, and it's as if Luigi's pain, which once felt intensely personal and internal, has now expanded into something much larger and colder. Character-wise, this is where Sarah truly steps into the spotlight as more than a plot catalyst. She becomes the anchor, the one who has to navigate both Luigi's lingering heartbreak from his ex and his newfound identity crisis as an heir thrust into a power struggle. The scenes where she sits in meetings with Luigi's family, trying to decode their passive-aggressive smiles, the underlying threats hidden in polite business language, are some of the tensest in the film, not because of overt shouting, but because you can see Sarah mentally switching gears from wife to strategist, from insider to outsider and back again. What makes their relationship compelling is that it never settles into just one mode. At times, Sarah is Luigi's boss-like partner, pushing him to toughen up and claim his place, telling him that if he wants to stop being dragged by life, he needs to learn to stand at the front of the room, own his narrative, and at other times, she is vulnerable with him, sharing her own scars, the reasons she built her career as a fortress, the moments when love felt like a liability rather than a refuge. There's a powerful scene where Luigi, already crushed once in love and now being slowly crushed again by his family's expectations, asks her, almost in a whisper, whether she regrets their marriage of convenience, whether he's just another project she took on to solve a temporary problem, and Sarah, after a long pause, admits that when she first proposed it, yes, it was purely transactional, almost clinical. She picked him because he was broken in a way that matched her own broken faith in relationships, but somewhere along the way, through late-night talks, mutual apologies, even shared silence, she started caring, and that terrifies her more than any corporate war. That's the emotional heartbeat of Dinikahi Setelah Putus, two people who stepped into marriage with their hearts locked away, only to slowly and reluctantly hand each other the keys. The performances sell this transformation. The actor playing Luigi brings this quiet, almost boyish sincerity to the role, a sense that he's always been a little too soft for the sharp edges of the world he was born into, and watching him gradually find his backbone, not by turning into some cold, ruthless businessman, but by learning to speak honestly about what he wants, to draw boundaries, to confront his half-brother head-on without losing his humanity, is incredibly satisfying. Meanwhile, the actress portraying Sarah has this magnetic presence. Even when she doesn't say much, you can read every calculation, every hesitation in her eyes, and the film gives her these small, intimate moments that peel back the armor, like when she sits alone in her car after a particularly brutal family dinner with Luigi's relatives, the camera just staying on her as she exhales, her hand trembling slightly on the steering wheel, the brave face she wore at the table finally cracking in the private space of the parked car. One of the film's strengths is how it uses visual motifs to track the evolution of their relationship. Doors, mirrors, and glass are recurring images. Early on, doors are always half-closed between them, literal thresholds that Luigi hesitates to cross in Sarah's pristine apartment, reflecting their emotional distance. Mirrors often show them separately, in different rooms, emphasizing how they are still living parallel lives even under the same roof. But as the story progresses, and especially as they begin to present a united front against Luigi's half-brother and the vultures circling within the conglomerate's upper ranks, we start to see more shared reflections, both of them in the same mirror, doors being left open, glass walls becoming less of a prison and more of a symbol of transparency as they decide to stop hiding things from each other. Thematically, Dinikahi Setelah Putus is juggling several threads, heartbreak and healing, obviously, but also class and privilege, the collision of personal and professional lives, and the idea that sometimes the family you choose, even if that choice initially comes in the form of a contract, can save you from the family you were born into. Luigi's journey from being a victim of circumstance, a man defined by being dumped and by running from his wealthy background, to becoming an active agent in his own life, is mirrored by Sarah's journey from control freak to someone willing to embrace uncertainty, to risk real emotional damage for the sake of a genuine connection. The power struggle with Luigi's half-brother is where the film dives most deeply into the politics of legacy. We learn, through a mix of flashbacks and tense present-day confrontations, that Luigi's childhood in this wealthy family wasn't as golden as it might seem. Maybe his mother was never fully accepted, maybe he grew up feeling like an outsider in his own home, which is why he fled that world in the first place. Meanwhile, his half-brother, who grew up inside the system, has internalized its values so deeply that he can't separate his self-worth from the empire he's trying to protect, and so, Luigi's re-emergence is not just a threat to his position, it's an existential threat. If the prodigal son returns and the father starts favoring him, what does that say about all the years the half-brother sacrificed his own dreams to keep the family name afloat? The boardroom scenes between the two brothers are some of the most riveting in the movie. There's something almost Shakespearean about watching them trade veiled insults disguised as polite business language, Luigi trying to stand firm without becoming as ruthless as the environment demands, his half-brother pushing every emotional button he can find, their shared childhood, their father's approval, even Sarah's presence, to destabilize him. Again, the film wisely avoids painting the half-brother as a one-note antagonist. We get glimpses of his vulnerability, his fear, the pressure he's under from other shareholders who see Luigi as a more marketable face for the company, and at times, you almost sympathize with him, because he is, in his own twisted way, also a victim of this toxic legacy of power. The pacing around this mid to late section can feel a bit dense, especially if you came in expecting a light-hearted romance based purely on the premise, but there's a deliberate rhythm to it, emotional beats between Luigi and Sarah at home, political maneuvering at the office, flashbacks feeding us context at just the right moments, and every time it risks feeling overwhelming, the film pulls us back into a quieter, more intimate space, maybe with a simple scene of the two of them cooking together, burning the food and laughing, reminding us that beneath all the noise of board meetings and shareholder votes, this story is still, fundamentally, about whether two wounded people can learn to trust each other. One of my favorite things about Dinikahi Setelah Putus is the way it portrays healing not as a neat, linear process but as a messy, looping journey. Luigi doesn't just wake up one day over his ex, he has moments of regression, of late-night doom scrolling through old photos, of catching himself comparing Sarah to the woman who left him. There's a particularly poignant scene where he runs into his ex by chance, months after the wedding disaster, and everything about it feels painfully realistic. There's no dramatic rain, no public screaming match, just an awkward, polite conversation in a supermarket aisle or a cafe, both of them dancing around the elephant in the room. The camera stays close to Luigi's face as he realizes that the ache he anticipates isn't as sharp as he expected. It's there, but dulled by time and by the fact that, for all its complicated origins, his life with Sarah has started to mean something real to him. At the same time, Sarah has to reckon with her own emotional baggage. We gradually learn why she built such thick walls, perhaps a past relationship where she was betrayed, maybe a childhood watching her mother sacrifice everything for a marriage that didn't fulfill her, and so when she first married Luigi, she told herself it was safe because it wasn't about love. But once feelings start to creep in, she panics. There are scenes where she pulls away, becomes colder, extra professional in how she communicates with him, and Luigi, already once abandoned, immediately senses the danger. Some of the most honest dialogue in the film happens in those moments when he pushes back, when he tells her he can't do a second silent breakup, that if she wants to leave, she has to say it to his face, not hide behind work or use the corporate war as an excuse. It's raw, messy, and it makes their eventual closeness feel earned, not preordained by genre. From a purely cinematic standpoint, the film is a treat. The score uses a mix of gentle piano and more modern, atmospheric tones, underscoring the emotional beats without overwhelming them. There are recurring music cues tied to Luigi's inner world versus Sarah's. His theme is softer, more acoustic, hers has a sharper, more electronic edge, and as they grow closer, those motifs start to blend, creating this subtle sonic metaphor for their merging lives. Visually, the contrast between the wedding that never was and the marriage that unexpectedly exists is woven through the movie. The cancelled wedding is all warm fairy lights, soft focus, pastel colors, the Instagrammable dream that dissolves into a nightmare, while Luigi and Sarah's official marriage is almost cold and administrative at first, shot in a government office with harsh fluorescent lighting, no flowers, just forms and pens and signatures. But over time, the spaces they share together acquire warmth, their home starts as a sterile, almost hotel-like apartment, and by the end, you start noticing personal touches, a plant Luigi stubbornly keeps alive, a mug of Sarah's that's chipped but she refuses to throw away, photos that aren't posed for social media but capture unguarded smiles. That subtle production design work does a lot of emotional heavy lifting. In terms of pacing, the movie definitely takes its time, it doesn't rush from beat to beat, and that might not work for every viewer. But if you're someone who enjoys sinking into characters' lives, watching them make small, almost mundane decisions that snowball into larger consequences, you'll probably appreciate it. The slower moments, the quiet breakfasts, the shared elevator rides, the late nights where they are both working on their laptops at the same table, barely talking but more comfortable in silence than they were in forced conversation at the beginning, all of that builds a sense of intimacy that makes the higher-stakes corporate drama in the later acts feel more grounded because it's not just about who wins the company, it's about who these two become in the process. Audience reactions to Dinikahi Setelah Putus, judging by the kind of story it is, would likely be intense. This is the sort of film that sparks debates, about whether Sarah was selfish or smart to propose the marriage, about whether Luigi was too quick to say yes, about whether you would, in your own life, ever consider something so outrageous in the aftermath of heartbreak. It taps into very contemporary anxieties in Indonesian society and beyond, the pressure to marry by a certain age, the way family expectations can shape or crush your romantic decisions, the power imbalance in relationships where one partner has significantly more money or status. There's also a cultural layer in how the film depicts the shame of a cancelled wedding. In many communities, that's not just a personal tragedy, it's a public humiliation that ripples through families, and the movie doesn't shy away from showing how Luigi has to deal not just with his own sorrow but with gossip, with relatives who can't stop asking, what happened, every time they see him, as if he owes them an explanation for his life falling apart. Sarah, too, represents a modern woman archetype that resonates, ambitious, unapologetically career-focused, but still trapped in a patriarchal system that measures her worth in terms of her role as a wife and mother. The film walks a smart line here, it doesn't punish her for her ambition, nor does it frame her eventual emotional vulnerability as a correction to her strong personality. Instead, it suggests that real strength might involve letting someone see you when you're not polished, when you're not in control, when your blazer is off and your guard is down. That's a message that hits hard, especially in a world where so many of us have learned to survive by curating our identities, by presenting only the most acceptable versions of ourselves online and at work. As for the cultural impact, a story like this, especially set in Indonesia, feels like part of a broader wave of Asian dramas that are pushing beyond simple boy meets girl tropes to explore more complex, messy adult relationships, where love is entangled with work, with money, with family legacies. You can easily imagine social media exploding with clips from the film, Luigi standing up to his father for the first time, Sarah delivering a scathing takedown of a board member who underestimates her, the scene where they finally admit, perhaps during a quiet night on a balcony overlooking the city, that what started as a convenience has become something neither of them predicted. People would relate, meme it, argue about it, write threads about why Sarah is right, or why Luigi deserves better, because the characters are written with that kind of nuance that invites projection. All of this builds toward a finale that, without spoiling specific twists, is less about whether they win the company or overthrow the half-brother and more about whether they choose each other when the dust settles. The corporate war, the family drama, all of that is essentially a crucible, a way of testing their still fragile partnership. Do they become each other's safe harbor, or just another stressful obligation in an already overloaded life? What the film does well is answer that question not with some grand, overblown romantic gesture, but with smaller, more grounded decisions, who shows up for whom in moments of crisis, who is willing to apologize first, whose dreams get prioritized when there's a conflict. In its final moments, Dinikahi Setelah Putus circles back emotionally to where it began. Luigi, the man who was once left at the altar, now stands at another threshold, another kind of altar, maybe not literal this time, but a symbolic one, a choice about what kind of husband, son, and person he wants to be. Sarah, who once treated relationships as problems to be solved rather than journeys to be experienced, has to decide whether she's willing to risk heartbreak again, not with a hypothetical future partner but with the man she already shares a home and a name with. The movie doesn't hand us a fairy tale in the classic sense. There's no guarantee that they'll be happy forever, no pretense that love magically fixes deeply rooted family trauma or erases years of emotional neglect. Instead, it offers us something quieter, more real, the image of two people deciding, eyes open, baggage and all, to walk forward together anyway. For me, that's what makes Dinikahi Setelah Putus linger after the credits roll. It's not just the juicy premise of married after breakup, or the drama of discovering you're actually a conglomerate heir battling your half-brother for control. It's the rawness of that opening heartbreak, the awkward, often funny middle of cohabiting with a stranger, the tension of navigating a world of money and power where love is often treated as a side note, and the slow, careful blooming of trust between two people who had every reason to give up on relationships. The movie is saying, in its own beautifully messy way, that life rarely goes according to plan, that the stories we write for ourselves, 6-year relationships, carefully scheduled weddings, linear career paths, can fall apart in an instant, and yet, in that wreckage, there might be room for something unexpected, something imperfect but honest. Dinikahi Setelah Putus is, ultimately, less about being married after breakup, and more about being brave after disappointment, about stepping into a future you didn't choose with someone you didn't expect, and slowly, painfully, joyfully, choosing them anyway. Imagine you're standing in a room that's been dressed to look like forever, flowers that cost more than a year of rent, chairs lined up like obedient witnesses, a suit that suddenly feels like it belongs to somebody else, and the one person who was supposed to walk toward you doesn't even show up with an apology, because sometimes the cruelest thing love can do is leave you alone in front of everyone with nothing to hold except your own embarrassment, and then, as if the universe has a twisted sense of humor, the very next door you open leads you straight into a marriage you didn't plan, with a woman you barely know, and a life you didn't realize was yours to lose. That's the kind of emotional whiplash Dinikahi Setelah Putus, 2025, is built on, and it doesn't just use that whiplash for cheap shock. This story turns it into a runway, launches it into romantic chaos, and then slams it headfirst into something even sharper: power, inheritance, and the kind of family conflict that doesn't bleed on the outside but stains everything it touches. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Now let's sink into this one properly, because Dinikahi Setelah Putus arrives in 2025 with a title that already feels like a dare, like it's saying, you think you know what happens after heartbreak. Watch this. On the surface, it's a romantic drama. With that deliciously outrageous premise people love to pitch in one sentence, guy gets dumped on his wedding day after 6 years, accidentally meets a beautiful director who proposes a sudden marriage, but the way it plays out is more like a slow-burning storm. It starts with one loud crack of thunder, then the sky keeps darkening until you realize the real danger wasn't the noise, it was what the rain would reveal. The opening stretch is the hook doing its job with brutal efficiency, because we're introduced to Luigi at the exact moment his life is supposed to become official. There's a specific kind of vulnerability a character has when they are dressed for a promise. You can't hide behind your usual identity, you're literally wearing the role you're about to step into. Luigi isn't introduced as some untouchable hero, he's presented like a man who has spent 6 years building a bridge to one person, and he's about to cross it, and then, without warning, the bridge is gone. And what makes that breakup sting in this story isn't just that she leaves, it's the timing, the public nature, the humiliating finality of it. A breakup on a random Tuesday is tragic. A breakup on your wedding day is a message carved into stone: I don't just reject you, I reject the future we rehearsed. The show knows that, and it lingers in those early scenes just long enough for you to feel the heat rising under your skin, that mix of shame, disbelief, and the worst feeling of all, powerlessness. Because that's what the abandoned at the altar setup really is. It's power. Somebody takes it from you in front of everyone. Luigi's pain is framed not just as sadness but as disorientation, and the direction, whether in the way the camera would hypothetically hang a little too long on his empty hand, or in the way the story lets the silence swell around him, makes you sit there thinking, okay, what does a person do after this? How do you continue being yourself when your entire next chapter just got erased? Then the plot does something that could have easily become ridiculous in the wrong hands, and that's where Dinikahi Setelah Putus surprises you. It leans into the absurdity of fate, but it grounds it in emotional logic. Luigi's chance encounter with Sarah isn't written like a random lottery win, it's written like two people colliding at their lowest and mistaking that collision for destiny because destiny is easier to accept than loneliness. Sarah is introduced as a director cantic, a beautiful director, but the important part isn't the beautiful, it's the director. She has authority. She's used to controlling outcomes. She's used to deciding what happens next. So when she appears in Luigi's wreckage and offers a path forward, an instant marriage, a sudden rewrite of his narrative, the story isn't just handing him a new love interest, it's handing him a lifeline that comes with strings attached, whether he sees them or not. And right away, the dynamic between them carries a tension that's honestly the best fuel for a romantic drama. Luigi is emotionally exposed, raw, reactive, still bleeding from a public wound. Sarah is composed, forward, almost too calm, like someone who has made a choice and is simply informing the world. The sudden marriage proposal could have been played purely for shock or comedy, and there are definitely moments where you can feel the entertainment value of the premise, like, wait, what do you mean you're asking him to marry you right now? But the show keeps returning to the question underneath, what makes a person say yes? Not in a fairy tale way, but in a human way. Is Luigi saying yes because he loves her? No. Is he saying yes because he trusts her? Not really. He says yes because the alternative is to go back into the room where everyone saw him get left behind and admit that he has no idea who he is without the relationship he just lost. And Sarah, for her part, doesn't ask because she's impulsive in a cute rom-com way, she asks like someone who has decided this is the move that solves multiple problems at once, and that slight chill beneath the romance is what makes her fascinating. Because even when the story invites you to ship them, it never lets you forget that this marriage begins as strategy, as survival, as escape, and anything romantic that grows later has to fight its way through that origin story like a flower pushing through concrete. The early, marriage kilat, phase is where the series, because it's paced like something with room to breathe, not like a 2-hour sprint, gets to play with the awkward intimacy of strangers forced into proximity. There's a particular kind of quiet comedy that happens when two people share a space before they've earned it, the pauses feel louder, the small talk feels like a negotiation, and every ordinary domestic detail becomes a test. The brilliance here is that the show doesn't only use those moments for laughs or sweetness, it uses them to build a psychological map of both characters. Luigi, freshly shattered, keeps looking for rules, keeps trying to understand what this new relationship is supposed to be. Sarah, in contrast, behaves like the rules are optional because she's used to being the one who writes them. And that's where the first big emotional question lands, is Sarah rescuing Luigi, or is she recruiting him? That question hangs over the story like a chandelier you know will eventually fall. Because just when Luigi starts to believe that this strange new marriage might be the calm after the storm, the narrative pulls the curtain back on the real engine driving everything. Luigi isn't just some unlucky guy who got dumped. Luigi is the son of a conglomerate. And if that sounds like a melodramatic twist, it is, on purpose, but it's also the moment the show reveals what it's really interested in exploring, what happens when your identity isn't something you choose, but something you inherit, and other people feel entitled to it. The conglomerate son revelation reframes everything. It reframes Luigi's breakup, because suddenly you can't help but wonder if the girlfriend leaving on the wedding day was only about love. It reframes Sarah's sudden proposal, because now the suspicion naturally creeps in, did she know? Is she connected? Is this romance a coincidence or a corporate chess move? And most importantly, it reframes Luigi's entire emotional arc, because now his heartbreak isn't just personal, it's political. It's not only about being left, it's about being vulnerable at exactly the moment people are most likely to use you. This is where the story shifts gears into that delicious genre blend, romance meets family power struggle. Luigi faces a new challenge, and it's not, how do I love again, it's, how do I survive my own bloodline? The conflict with his step-sibling, his addict Tyri, adds a specific kind of venom to the narrative, because rivalry within a family isn't just competition, it's a fight over belonging. If a stranger tries to steal your job, you get angry. If a sibling tries to steal your inheritance, you start questioning whether you were ever loved in the first place. The show taps into that, and you can feel how the tension changes from romantic uncertainty to existential threat. Boardrooms, family dinners, forced smiles, polite words that hide knives. Suddenly the emotional battlefield isn't just Luigi's heart, it's the entire architecture of his life. And what I appreciate is that Dinikahi Setelah Putus doesn't pretend money solves pain. In fact, it argues the opposite: wealth just gives pain better lighting. You get bigger rooms to be lonely in. You get nicer clothes to cry in. You get legal documents that can hurt you in ways a poor person never has to imagine. Luigi's journey becomes less about acquiring power and more about realizing that power has been circling him like sharks his whole life, and he simply never noticed because he was too busy trying to be a normal guy in love. Sarah becomes even more intriguing in this half of the story because her director identity starts to matter in a new way. A director isn't just someone with a job title, it's someone trained to stage reality, to manage perception, to tell a story that people will believe. And in a conglomerate family war, perception is currency. Suddenly Sarah's skill set doesn't just make her a strong love interest, it makes her a potential kingmaker, or a potential puppet master. Their marriage, which began as a chaotic rebound, now sits at the center of a corporate conflict, and the show plays with the unsettling idea that intimacy can be weaponized. When Sarah stands next to Luigi, she isn't just a wife, she's a symbol, a shield, a scandal, a headline, an asset. When Luigi stands next to Sarah, he isn't just a husband, he's an entry point into a dynasty, a name on paper, a signature that could decide who owns what. The story gets a lot of tension out of that, and it's the kind of tension that makes you keep watching because you're not only asking, will they fall in love, you're asking, if they do, will it be real, and will it survive the fact that everyone around them has a price? Spoiler controlled, the plot moves through a series of escalating confrontations where Luigi is forced to show a spine he didn't know he had, and Sarah is forced to reveal whether she has a heart behind the strategy. You watch Luigi go from a man who was defined by being chosen by his girlfriend to a man who has to choose himself, choose what kind of heir he wants to be, what kind of man he wants to become, and whether he's willing to fight for something other than romance. And you watch Sarah navigate the razor's edge of being a woman with power in a world that will always assume that power must have been borrowed from a man. One of the strongest pleasures of this series is how it uses the marriage premise as a pressure cooker for character. In a normal romance, trust builds slowly through dates, conversations, shared memories. Here, trust is demanded immediately because the world sees them as a unit even when they don't feel like one. That creates scenes where the emotional stakes feel doubled. A private disagreement can become a public disaster, a moment of tenderness can become a tool someone photographs, a fight can become a rumor that moves stock prices, metaphorically or literally depending on how the show frames it. And as a reviewer, what you start to notice is how the show uses that setup to explore performance. Everyone is performing. Luigi performed, groom, then got humiliated. Sarah performs, wife, but we're never fully sure what she feels. The step-sibling performs, family, while sharpening an agenda. The conglomerate world performs respectability, while hiding greed. Even love, in this story, is forced to perform under lights. That's why the emotional moments hit when they are quiet, when the performance drops for a second. When Luigi is alone and you can see the weight of expectation sinking into his shoulders. When Sarah stops speaking like a CEO and says something that sounds like a person. When the two of them share a silence that isn't awkward but heavy, like they're both listening to the same fear. The pacing of Dinikahi Setelah Putus is interesting because it dares to begin with maximum drama, and then it has to justify that drama by going deeper rather than bigger. And for the most part, it does. Instead of constantly trying to top, dumped at the altar, it treats that moment as the wound everything else grows around. Luigi's abandonment becomes a lens through which he interprets every new threat. When his step-sibling moves against him, it doesn't feel like just business, it feels like another version of being left behind. When Sarah keeps secrets, it doesn't feel like intrigue, it feels like betrayal waiting to happen. That's a smart emotional through line, because it makes the later conflicts feel personal even when they are corporate. And the show's best episodes, or best stretches, depending on how you're watching it, are the ones that let the romance and the power struggle collide in the same scene. Like when a tender moment between Luigi and Sarah is interrupted by a phone call that reminds them their names are weapons. Or when Luigi wants to be vulnerable but can't, because vulnerability in his family is basically an invitation to be eaten. Or when Sarah seems to be helping him win, but you can't tell if she's helping him because she loves him or because she's invested in the outcome. That ambiguity is where the series lives, and it's why people end up arguing online about Sarah in particular, because she's written to trigger two opposite readings at once. She's either the savior who stepped into Luigi's ruin and gave him a second chance, or she's the strategist who saw a broken heir and realized she could guide him like a chess piece. And the most compelling answer is that she might be both, because people are messy, and the show understands that messy people make the best drama. Let's talk character impressions more directly, because a story like this rises or falls on whether you believe in the faces carrying it. Luigi, as a protagonist, is designed to be accessible at first, heartbroken guy, relatable humiliation, and then slowly revealed as someone whose life has been kept from him, or perhaps someone who kept himself from his own reality because it was easier to be just Luigi than Luigi, son of a conglomerate. There's a specific tragedy in that. He thought he was living a simple love story, and it turns out he was living a protected lie, and the moment that lie collapses, everyone expects him to become a predator in a world he never trained for. That's a solid foundation for a lead, because it gives him internal conflict beyond the external plot. Meanwhile, Sarah is the kind of character who can easily become a trope if mishandled, the cold, capable, gorgeous executive who melts for the right man, but Dinikahi Setelah Putus keeps her from melting too quickly, and that restraint is crucial. When she shows warmth, it feels earned. When she shows ruthlessness, it feels consistent. And the tension between those two sides, warmth and ruthlessness, becomes the question of her love. Is her love soft? Is it conditional? Is it a decision she makes like a business contract? And if it is, does that make it less real, or just real in a different language? The step-sibling antagonist energy, again, without diving into unnecessary invented details, works because the threat isn't supernatural or distant, it's intimate. They share a family tree. Their conflict is rooted in legitimacy, in who gets to sit at the table, who gets to speak for the family, who gets to be seen as the rightful heir. That kind of rivalry brings out the ugliest parts of people because it isn't about winning, it's about being recognized. And the show does a good job making the power struggle feel like. It has emotional consequences. It's not just contracts and board votes, it's childhood resentments, unspoken grudges, and the painful reality that family can love you and still try to destroy you. Now, cinematically and emotionally, the series plays like it wants to be both glossy and bruised, and that's a tricky balance. The conglomerate world naturally invites sleek visuals, modern offices, upscale houses, high-end events, and the romance premise invites warm intimacy, shared rooms, late-night conversations, small gestures. The best direction choices are the ones that contrast those spaces to show how Luigi and Sarah are being pulled in different directions. There's something inherently cinematic about a character walking through a luxurious hallway while feeling completely trapped. There's something heartbreaking about a beautiful bedroom that doesn't feel safe because the relationship inside it is still negotiating its truth. And if the production leans into that contrast, bright, polished public spaces versus dim, honest private moments, it turns the story into a visual metaphor. Public life is shiny but suffocating, private life is messy but real. The emotional analysis really comes down to the core promise of the title, being married after being dumped. That's not just a plot twist, it's a psychological experiment. What happens when you skip the healing phase and jump straight into a new commitment? Most stories treat moving on like a montage. This one makes moving on the entire battlefield. Luigi carries the ghost of a 6-year relationship into his new marriage like a suitcase he can't put down. And Sarah, whether she admits it or not, is marrying a man who is not emotionally empty, is emotionally overcrowded. That creates jealousy without even introducing a new rival, because the rival is memory. It creates intimacy problems that aren't about attraction, but about presence. Is Luigi actually here with Sarah, or is he still stuck in the moment he got left behind? And that's what makes some of the quieter scenes more powerful than the corporate fireworks. When Luigi flinches at kindness because he doesn't trust it. When Sarah offers something gentle and then withdraws because she realizes gentleness gives Luigi power over her, and she's not used to being the one who risks. That's the kind of push-pull dynamic that can feel painfully real even in a heightened premise, because the emotions underneath are recognizable: fear of abandonment, fear of being used, fear of being unlovable once someone has seen you fail publicly. The themes, to me, revolve around three big words: replacement, revelation, and ownership. Replacement is obvious. Luigi is replaced on his wedding day, then tries to replace his loss with a new marriage. But the show asks whether people are replaceable at all, or whether we just try to replace the pain with noise. Revelation is the twist that Luigi's identity is bigger than he thought, and that revelation doesn't set him free, it cages him in new expectations. And ownership is everywhere: who owns the company, who owns the family name, who owns the narrative of what happened at that wedding, who owns Luigi's future, who owns Sarah's motivations, and even, in a romantic sense, who thinks they own another person's loyalty. The show plays with ownership as both desire and sickness. Luigi wants to own his life again after losing control. Sarah wants to own outcomes because uncertainty scares her. The step-sibling wants to own legitimacy. And the conglomerate world itself treats human relationships like assets. That's why the romance, if it works for you, feels like a rebellion. If Luigi and Sarah can love each other genuinely in a world that moneizes everything, then love becomes the one thing money can't fully buy. But the series doesn't make that easy. It constantly tests the romance with practical stakes: reputation, inheritance, trust, the consequences of impulsive vows. Performances, again speaking as a reviewer in a voiceover sense rather than naming awards or behind-the-scenes trivia we can't confirm, need to sell two different tones at once: melodrama and sincerity. And the story demands micro-expressions: the forced smile at a family event, the slight pause before answering a question about love, the way a character's eyes shift when a lie is told politely. Luigi's actor has to make you believe that this man can be both wounded and dangerous, because an heir who cannot become dangerous will be eaten alive. Sarah's actor has to make you believe that control is her comfort blanket, but that underneath it there's something that aches, even if she would never call it that. When those performances hit, the show becomes addictive because you're not just watching plot, you're watching two people learn how to breathe in a room full of smoke. Pacing-wise, the risk with a premise like this is that it can become a never-ending escalation of twists, secret after secret, betrayal after betrayal, until it feels like a soap opera spinning wheels. Dinikahi Setelah Putus flirts with that edge because the ingredients are naturally so soap-ready: surprise marriage, secret heir, family war. But what keeps it engaging is when it remembers to return to consequences. A twist matters only if it changes how a character feels. The show's strongest momentum comes from letting events leave scars. Luigi's trust doesn't reset after an episode. Sarah's masks don't drop and then magically reappear without cost. The family conflict doesn't stay in the office, it leaks into the marriage. And the marriage doesn't stay in the bedroom, it leaks into the business. That interconnection gives the narrative a sense of inevitability, like all these threads were always going to tighten around them. Now, in terms of audience reaction and cultural impact, a story like this is basically engineered for conversation, especially in an Indonesian pop culture context where romantic melodrama and family status conflicts have a deep, loyal audience. The premise is memeable: getting dumped on the wedding day is already a social media headline, and married immediately after is the kind of jaw-drop twist that gets clipped, reposted, and argued about in comment sections at midnight. People love debating whether Sarah is green flag or red flag, whether Luigi is naive or secretly smart, whether the ex who left him is villainous or just human, whether the step-sibling is pure evil or shaped by a lifetime of being treated as second class inside their own family. And what tends to happen with shows like this is that viewers don't just watch, they pick sides. They rewrite scenes in their heads. They imagine alternate choices. They project their own experiences of betrayal, rebound relationships, and family pressure onto the characters. If the show hits the emotional notes, it becomes a mirror people argue with. And culturally, it taps into a tension that resonates beyond romance: the idea that love and money are never fully separate, that family expectations can turn affection into obligation, and that public image can be a prison. Even if you've never been near a conglomerate boardroom in your life, you understand what it feels like to have your future discussed by people who don't ask what you want. You understand what it feels like to be judged by a group, to be compared to a sibling, to be measured against an invisible standard. That's why these stories travel. The setting is wealthy, but the emotional logic is universal. The show also plays into a fantasy that's complicated, the fantasy of being chosen immediately, of being wanted so intensely that someone says, "Marry me now." For viewers who have felt disposable, that fantasy is intoxicating. But the show doesn't let it stay pure, it poisons the fantasy with suspicion. Why now? Why you? What's the catch? That tension turns wish fulfillment into drama, and that's a smart move, because pure wish fulfillment gets boring. Suspicion keeps you watching. And I think that's where Dinikahi Setelah Putus finds its most addictive flavor. It's romantic, but it's not safe. It's glossy, but it's not comforting. It gives you tenderness, then immediately reminds you tenderness can be used against you. Now, let me talk about the emotional center, because for all the corporate moves and family rivalry, the core question is still heartbreak. What do you do when the person you built your life around walks away at the exact moment you were about to make it permanent? The show's answer isn't, find someone new and forget. It's, rebuild yourself in public while everyone watches and judges your reconstruction. Luigi's arc is less about replacing his ex and more about reclaiming his agency. He starts as someone to whom things happen, dumped, humiliated, swept into a sudden marriage, thrown into a family war, and the satisfying part is watching whether he stays that way or becomes someone who makes things happen. Sarah's arc, meanwhile, is about whether she can allow herself to be changed by love without seeing that change as weakness. Because for a person like her, love isn't a candlelit dinner, love is risk, exposure, loss of control. And the more the show pushes them into high-stakes situations, the more it asks, can a relationship that begins as a reaction become a real choice? Can a marriage built on urgency become a marriage built on understanding? Or will it always have that fracture line running through it, the crack where the original pain lives? The series is at its best when it treats that fracture line like a living thing. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it screams. But it's always there, and you can feel the characters trying to step around it without falling in. When the power struggle intensifies, it forces Luigi and Sarah to either become partners for real or collapse into mistrust. Because you can't fight a family dynasty war as two individuals pretending to be married, you need unity. And unity requires truth. So every secret becomes heavier. Every half-truth becomes more dangerous. And the show wrings drama from the simple act of asking, why didn't you tell me? Because in a marriage, especially a sudden one, information is intimacy. Sharing facts is sharing power. And refusing to share is a kind of betrayal. If you're watching as a fan of romance, you'll probably be there for the slow build of genuine affection, those moments when Sarah does something small that proves she's paying attention, when Luigi finally makes her laugh in a way that isn't polite, when they defend each other in public without even discussing it, like instinct. If you're watching as a fan of melodrama, you're there for the confrontations, the family meetings where every compliment is an insult, the corporate maneuvers that feel like chess played with people's lives, the step-sibling pushing buttons to expose Luigi's weaknesses. If you're watching as someone who loves character studies, you're there for the scenes where Luigi sits with the memory of his ex and realizes he may have loved the idea of stability more than he loved the actual person, and the scenes where Sarah looks at her own reflection and wonders whether she knows how to be loved without turning it into a transaction. And because the show is designed to satisfy all three audiences, it ends up with a tone that's very bingeable, emotional cliffhanger mixed with quiet payoffs, tenderness mixed with threat, romance mixed with a constant sense that something could break at any time. It's like watching someone carry a glass of water through a crowded room. You're tense the entire time, not because you want them to spill, but because you know the room doesn't care if they do. There's also something interesting about how the story frames masculinity and vulnerability. Luigi begins the story in a traditionally masculine position, groom, provider, man with a plan, and then gets publicly stripped of that role. Many stories would respond by making him instantly hard, instantly vengeful, instantly dominant. This one, at least in its emotional intent, lets him be shattered first. It lets him be embarrassed. It lets him be unsure. And then it asks him to rebuild, not by becoming a bully, but by becoming clear. Strength in this story isn't about being loud, it's about being unmovable when it matters. Sarah, on the other hand, complicates femininity and power. She's not written as a soft trophy, she's written as a person with agency. But the show also acknowledges that agency in a romantic context can be misread. When a woman proposes sudden marriage, people assume she's scheming. When a man does it, people assume he's bold. The show plays in that double standard and uses it as tension. Sarah is judged constantly, and sometimes Luigi himself can't fully separate his gratitude from suspicion. That's real, and it makes their relationship more layered than a simple, love heals all, narrative. Now, I'm going to keep spoilers controlled, but I do want to talk about how the story handles escalation, because that's where a lot of 2025 romantic dramas either soar or crash. Dinikahi Setelah Putus escalates by tightening the net around Luigi rather than constantly introducing random new villains. The step-sibling conflict is the spine. The family's expectations are the cage. The public image is the spotlight. And Sarah is both the key and the lock. So when new problems arise, they feel like natural extensions of those forces. A rumor isn't random, it's a weapon. A family gathering isn't filler, it's a battlefield with table manners. A romantic date isn't just romance, it's a rare pocket of oxygen. That structural cohesion is what makes the show feel cinematic even in dialogue-heavy stretches. The drama has architecture. And because it has architecture, the emotional moments land with more weight. You feel like the characters earned them by surviving the structure. If there's a critique to be made, it's that the premise is so packed with high drama elements that sometimes the subtlety risks getting crowded out. There may be moments where you can feel the story reaching for maximum tension, where a misunderstanding could be solved by one honest conversation but isn't, because the plot needs to keep moving. That's a common issue in this genre, and whether it bothers you depends on your tolerance for melodrama mechanics. But even when it leans into heightened drama, it usually grounds the emotion well enough that you'll forgive it, because you're not just watching problems, you're watching how these two people respond to pressure. And that's ultimately why you stay. The soundtrack, the mood, the overall vibe, again, speaking in a review voice rather than pretending we have a production sheet in front of us, feels like it's designed to amplify longing and anxiety. A story like this needs music that can do two jobs, sell romance and sell threat. It needs those soft themes that make a glance feel like a confession, and it needs those low pulses that make a family conversation feel like a trap. When that balance is right, you get that cinematic sweep where the romance feels big but the danger feels bigger. And the visual language of wealth, glass walls, high ceilings, polished surfaces, works as emotional symbolism, because everything in Luigi's new world is reflective. Everyone can see themselves. Everyone can see you. There's nowhere to hide. Even love is visible, and visibility is dangerous. As the audience, you become hyper-aware of who is watching in every scene, because the show trains you to understand that privacy is a luxury Luigi and Sarah don't actually have, even when they are alone, because secrets sit between them like a third person. The cultural conversation around stories like this often centers on morality, who is right, who is wrong, who deserves happiness, and Dinikahi Setelah Putus benefits from not making those answers too clean. Luigi is sympathetic, but he isn't perfect. His wound can make him unfair. His insecurity can make him suspicious. Sarah is impressive, but she can be cold, and her decisiveness can look like manipulation. The step-sibling may be antagonistic, but the show's very premise, inheritance, legitimacy, hierarchy, invites you to ask what kind of environment creates someone who believes they have to take to survive. Even the ex who left Luigi, while obviously positioned as the source of the initial trauma, exists as a shadow that raises questions. Did Luigi ignore signs? Did he take the relationship for granted? Was the 6-year love story already rotting before the wedding day simply exposed it? Those questions make the story richer, because they turn the breakup into more than a villain act, they turn it into a mystery of emotional neglect and timing and secrets. And because the story then catapults Luigi into a new marriage so quickly, you're forced to compare two kinds of love, the long familiar love that still ended, and the sudden unfamiliar love that might survive. Which one is more real? The one that had history, or the one that has intention? The show seems to suggest that history is not proof. Intention matters. Choice matters. The way you show up matters. And that's a theme that resonates with modern audiences who are tired of the idea that time invested automatically equals love earned. Sometimes you can be with someone for 6 years and still not be chosen when it counts. Sometimes someone new can choose you immediately, but you still have to decide whether that choice is love or convenience. That's the emotional poison and sweetness of this story. It understands that being chosen can feel like salvation, but it can also be a trap if you don't know why you were chosen. And that brings us back to Sarah, because Sarah's why is the engine of suspense. If you watch the series with your guard up, you'll read every generous act as strategy. If you watch it with your heart open, you'll read every cold moment as fear. The show wants you to live in that uncertainty, because uncertainty is what makes romance feel risky. And risky romance is what makes viewers binge at 2 a.m., whispering, "Just tell the truth already," even though they know the truth might destroy everything. As we move toward the later parts of the story, the question stops being, will Luigi recover from being dumped, and becomes, what is Luigi willing to become? Because inheritance stories always demand transformation, and not always for the better. Power doesn't just give you options, it tests your soul. Luigi is forced to negotiate with parts of himself he never had to use before: ambition, suspicion, strategic thinking, controlled anger. And Sarah is forced to negotiate with parts of herself she's kept locked away: tenderness, dependence, vulnerability, the desire to be understood rather than obeyed. Their marriage becomes a crucible. And the family war becomes a mirror. The more Luigi fights for power, the more he risks becoming like the people he hates. The more Sarah helps him, the more she risks losing herself in the role she created. That's compelling drama because it's not just about winning the company, it's about whether winning costs them their humanity. Audience reaction to this kind of arc is usually intense, because people project their own experiences with toxic families, with workplace politics, with relationships that start as rebounds and then unexpectedly become the real thing. Some viewers will root for Luigi to burn everything down. Others will want him to walk away from the wealth entirely. Some will want Sarah to be revealed as a mastermind. Others will want her to be the one safe person in the story. That split reaction is a sign the show is doing something right. It's not spoon-feeding a single interpretation. It's giving you characters that can be read multiple ways, and that's what keeps a series alive in conversation long after the credits. And if there's cultural impact beyond memes and shipping wars, it's in how it dramatizes the intersection of romance and social status. In many societies, including Indonesia's, marriage is not just private love, it's family, reputation, economics, community. Dinikahi Setelah Putus takes that truth and amplifies it until it becomes almost gothic: marriage as battlefield, marriage as shield, marriage as prison. And because it begins with a wedding disaster, it sets the tone early. Ceremonies don't guarantee sincerity. Rings don't guarantee loyalty. Public promises can be broken in public. That's a cynical starting point, but the series uses that cynicism as a foundation to build a more fragile hope. Maybe love isn't proven by ceremonies, maybe it's proven by what someone does when the ceremony is over and life gets ugly. That's where Luigi and Sarah's relationship, if you buy into it, becomes emotionally satisfying, not because it's perfect, but because it's tested. It's tested by gossip. Tested by family sabotage. Tested by the temptation to use each other. Tested by the ghosts they bring into the marriage. And when you see them choose each other despite those tests, it feels like a victory that's more meaningful than a simple happy ending kiss, because it's not just romance, it's defiance. Let's land this with a final emotional verdict, because Dinikahi Setelah Putus is one of those titles that tells you exactly what kind of ride you're in for, but it still manages to surprise you with how far it takes the consequences. If you come for a breezy rom-com about rebound marriage, you might be shocked by how quickly it dives into inheritance politics and emotional manipulation. If you come for a corporate family war, you might be surprised by how much time it spends making you feel the ache of Luigi's humiliation and the slow, cautious way Sarah and Luigi learn what it means to be partners rather than props. It's melodramatic, yes, and it leans into heightened twists because that's part of its DNA, but underneath the big swings there's a surprisingly human pulse: the fear of being abandoned, the hunger to be chosen, the temptation to turn love into strategy, and the painful truth that sometimes the life you thought you were building was never really yours to begin with. The show's biggest strength is that it doesn't treat Luigi's wedding day breakup as a gimmick, it treats it as a scar that shapes every choice afterward. And its most addictive question isn't, who will win the company, It's, who will these people become once they stop pretending? By the time you reach the emotional peaks, you're not just watching plot, you're watching two damaged adults trying to build something real in a world that rewards performance over honesty. And that, for me, is what makes Dinikahi Setelah Putus worth your time in 2025. It's a romantic drama that understands romance isn't just chemistry, it's courage, and in a story where vows begin as a reaction and power is always lurking behind the curtain, courage is the only thing that can turn a reckless marriage into a meaningful one. And the more you sit with this story, the more layers you start to peel back, because on a surface level you can watch Dinikahi Setelah Putus as a dramatic fantasy of second chances and secret wealth, but underneath, it's quietly asking you very uncomfortable questions about your own life and the stories you tell yourself to survive. And that's something I really noticed when I went back over some of the key scenes in my head, starting right from that disastrous wedding day again, because that sequence isn't just there to shock you, it's a blueprint for almost every emotional beat that follows. Look at how it's constructed. Luigi doesn't get a big, cathartic outburst in that moment, he gets silence, confusion, the bitter taste of being the last one to know that something died a long time ago, and if you think about it, that silent humiliation sets the tone for his arc. He's a man who has let life happen to him, let other people make the decisions, from his ex deciding when to end things to his family deciding what role he should play in their empire. So when Sarah appears with this wild proposition, on first watch it seems like the moment he finally does something radical, but even then, he's still partly reacting, still saying yes because he cannot stand being the guy everyone pities, and the film knows this. It doesn't romanticize that decision, it treats it as half act of rebellion, half act of surrender, which is such an honest way to depict a rebound that's dressed up as a new beginning. That's why I love that the movie gives us messy, small, human scenes right after the marriage happens. Instead of jumping straight into luxury and drama, we see Luigi in Sarah's apartment, that immaculate, almost intimidating space that screams, "Do not touch anything," wandering around like a guest at a museum, unsure where he's even allowed to sit. There's a moment where he opens the fridge and everything is neatly organized, labels facing outward, meal prep containers lined up like soldiers, and he shuts it almost guiltily after taking just a bottle of water, because he doesn't feel like anything there is his yet. That tiny beat tells you more about their emotional dynamic at the beginning than any exposition could. Sarah, on the other hand, is almost disturbingly composed those first few days. She treats their marriage like a project she just added to her calendar. There's a scene where she literally creates a shared schedule for house chores and finances in a Google document, and Luigi just nods along, overwhelmed, because he's used to measuring relationships in emotions, not Excel sheets. The film uses those differences to create both comedy and tension. The first time he calls her sayang out of habit, because that's what he used to call his ex, she freezes for half a second before covering it with a dry joke, and you can feel the awkwardness, the guilt, but also that hint of tenderness trying to find a way through all the contracts and boundaries they've put up. That's another thing Dinikahi Setelah Putus does remarkably well. It shows how the ghosts of past relationships don't vanish just because you sign a new marriage certificate. Luigi's ex is never demonized, she doesn't come back as a cartoon villain to ruin his new life, and that's a surprisingly mature choice. Instead, she exists as a memory, as a possibility of a life that didn't happen, and occasionally as a real person he runs into in a world that's too small to let you cleanly escape your history. The way the camera treats her is telling. When we see her in flashbacks, everything is soft, warm, brightly lit, but when we see her in the present, after the breakup, the color palette is cooler, more grounded, as if the comfort of nostalgia is being stripped away to reveal a more complicated reality. She's not the one who got away, she's the one who wasn't right anymore. And there's something incredibly cathartic about watching Luigi slowly, painfully realize that while the pain of losing her is real, the idea that she was the only possible love story for him was an illusion he clung to out of fear of starting over. Sarah's past, by contrast, is more atmospheric, less literal. The film doesn't give us as many detailed flashbacks of her previous relationships or childhood, and that's a smart choice, because Sarah is a character who lives in the present and the future, who hates introspection because it makes her feel vulnerable. Instead, we see her past in fragments, a phone call with a mother who makes small, cutting remarks about how no man will ever keep up with your attitude, the way Sarah's expression freezes when an older male colleague jokes that she's too fierce to be wife material, the scar on her wrist we only notice when she's pouring wine, which is never explained but silently suggests she's been through something that left marks. Those hints invite you to fill in the gaps, and in doing so, they pull you closer to her inner world without over-explaining it. Costume design plays a huge role in tracking her evolution. At the start, she's all sharp lines and neutral colors, blazers that could double as armor, sleek ponytails, heels that sound like a judge's gavel on hallway floors. But as her relationship with Luigi deepens, her wardrobe softens, not in a sexist, she becomes more feminine to be lovable way, but in subtler ways. She's in oversized sweaters at home, barefaced on weekends, her hair down when she's cooking with him, and those visuals tell you she's allowing herself to inhabit a version of womanhood that doesn't have to constantly perform strength. Luigi's external transformation is slower but equally deliberate. Early on, he looks almost out of place in Sarah's world, and later in the polished halls of his family's business. His shirts are slightly wrinkled, his posture a bit slouched, his eyes often cast downward as if he's trying to make himself smaller. As the story goes on and he begins to accept not just his circumstances but his own worth, you see him gradually adopt a cleaner, more tailored look, not because Sarah or his family forces him to, but because he starts occupying his space differently, shoulders squared, eye contact steady. There's a key turning point where he walks into a boardroom full of people who used to dismiss him as the soft one, and you can instantly tell he's changed, not only because of the suit he's wearing but because of the quiet confidence in his step, the way he sets his notebook on the table without fumbling, the calm way he introduces himself not as an accident of birth but as someone who has chosen to be there. Yet even in that moment, the film doesn't turn him into a stereotypical alpha male. His strength remains empathetic, his leadership style collaborative, and that's a powerful antithesis to his half-brother's more aggressive, fear-based approach. Speaking of the half-brother, the movie really leans into that relational dynamic as a mirror of what Luigi could become if he let bitterness define him. The half-brother is sharper, more efficient, perhaps even more competent in some areas, but he's hollowed out by resentment. There's this scene where the two of them are alone for once, away from the watching eyes of the board and the manipulation of their father, maybe in an old family vacation house or a private office late at night, and Luigi, genuinely trying to bridge the gulf, asks, "Why does it have to be a war between us?" And the half-brother just laughs, this short, joyless sound, and says something like, "Because that's the only language this family understands." That line hit me because it sums up the tragedy of so many legacy families. They train their children not to love or support each other but to compete, to see every small gain for someone else as a loss for themselves. You realize in that moment that the half-brother's villainy is learned, not innate, and that inasmuch as he hurts Luigi and Sarah, he's also trapped in a role he doesn't know how to escape. And that's where Sarah becomes such a pivotal character in the larger ecosystem of this story. She's the outsider who can see how toxic the whole thing is, who can tell Luigi, "You don't have to play by their rules," when generations of conditioning have told him that there is no other way. There's an incredible scene where Sarah, during a tense family dinner, boldly challenges a casual sexist comment from an uncle or board member about women not being cut out for leadership, and you can feel the whole table stiffen, the father exchanging loaded glances with the half-brother, while Luigi instinctively goes into peacemaker mode, trying to smooth things over. Later, he calls her out gently, saying she escalated things, and Sarah snaps back that the problem isn't her tone but the fact that no one else at the table ever speaks up. That argument between them is uncomfortable, because they are both right in different ways. Luigi has spent his whole life surviving by not rocking the boat, by absorbing disrespect for the sake of peace, while Sarah has survived her world by fighting every battle head-on, and now they are forced to confront how those survival strategies clash when they are supposed to be on the same team. The resolution to that fight isn't some simple compromise where one of them magically changes overnight. Instead, you see them gradually influence each other. Luigi starts to speak up more in family and corporate contexts, finding his own style of assertiveness that doesn't mimic Sarah but is certainly inspired by her bravery. Sarah, meanwhile, learns that not every moment needs to be a battlefield. Sometimes, choosing your battles is also a kind of power, especially when you're operating in a fundamentally corrupt system that will use any excuse to discredit you. I also want to talk about the humor, because despite how heavy all of this sounds, Dinikahi Setelah Putus is surprisingly funny in the right places, and those moments of levity are crucial. They keep the story from sinking into pure gloom and actually make the dramatic punches hit harder. Luigi has a best friend, and every good heartbreak story needs one, who serves as both comic relief and emotional anchor. This friend is the first one we see trying to cheer Luigi up after the cancelled wedding, cracking dark jokes, making memes out of the disaster in a way that only a real friend can get away with. Later, when Luigi drops the bomb that he just got married to a near stranger who happens to be his boss, the friend's reaction is priceless, a mix of disbelief, lecture, and reluctant support. Through him, the movie gets to voice the audience's own skepticism, asking all the "you insane" questions out loud, and through their conversations, you start to understand that Luigi is not just drifting, he's actively trying to rewrite his story, even if he doesn't have the script fully figured out. Sarah's assistant at work plays a similar dual role for her. At first, this assistant is just the overworked, underpaid, hypercompetent junior who keeps Sarah's life from collapsing, sending her reminders, fixing her calendar, discreetly handing her a snack when she forgets to eat. But as the story goes on and Sarah's marital status suddenly changes, this assistant becomes a witness to her emotional thaw. There's a beautiful little moment where Sarah, who is notoriously private, accidentally lets slip a smile while reading a text from Luigi, and the assistant catches it and teases her gently, and you can see the walls crack just a bit. Side characters like these prevent the story from becoming too claustrophobically focused on the main couple and give us windows into how others perceive their relationship, and that's important, because love stories don't happen in a vacuum, they are always being watched, commented on, judged, especially in a culture where family and community have strong opinions about everything. On the technical side, the editing deserves special mention. The film uses cross-cutting very effectively to draw parallels between different arenas of conflict in Luigi's life. During one particularly intense sequence, we cut back and forth between Luigi fumbling through his first high-stakes presentation at the family company and Sarah navigating a crisis at her own workplace, each of them facing down an older, more experienced opponent who underestimates them. The way those scenes are intercut, with their separate struggles building in intensity before finally culminating in both of them succeeding in their own ways, creates this sense of them fighting parallel battles, unaware of how much they are mirroring each other, and it primes you emotionally for the later part of the film where they start to actually coordinate, to consciously be on the same team. In another instance, flashbacks to Luigi's childhood at lavish family events are interwoven with shots of him and Sarah awkwardly hosting a small dinner for friends in their apartment, burning the food and laughing it off, and the contrast between the stiff, performative opulence of his past and the messy authenticity of his present hits you on a subconscious level. This is what building a real home looks like. Not choreographed photographs and expensive centerpieces, but shared failures and jokes and dishes that don't turn out right. Musically, there's one recurring song, a soft, melancholic track with a simple guitar line and a chorus about, starting after the ending, that the film deploys very sparingly, and every time it surfaces, it hits harder. The first time we hear it is right after the wedding is cancelled, over a montage of Luigi wandering through a city that suddenly feels unfamiliar. The second time is during a quiet moment when Sarah falls asleep on the couch after another exhausting day, and Luigi gently covers her with a blanket, hesitating for a second before brushing a stray hair out of her face. The last time we hear it, much later in the film, is in a completely different emotional context, when they are not just cohabitants learning to be kind to each other but partners who have survived something together, and the same melody now carries a sense of hard-won peace. It's those kinds of recurring motifs that make Dinikahi Setelah Putus feel cohesive and intentional, rather than just a string of dramatic episodes. Now, it wouldn't be an honest review if I didn't also talk about the moments where the film stumbles a bit, because as ambitious as it is, it's not flawless. There are definitely sections, especially around the midpoint where the corporate succession plotline kicks into high gear, where the pacing wobbles. You get a run of boardroom scenes and hushed strategy meetings that, while thematically rich, can feel a bit repetitive if you're more invested in the emotional journey than the business drama. Some of the expositional dialogue around company shares, legal clauses, and inheritance conditions veers into on-the-nose territory, where characters are clearly explaining things for the audience's benefit rather than because it's how they would naturally talk. A few viewers might also feel that the half-brothers' machinations cross the line into melodrama at times, especially if there are subplots involving forged documents or orchestrated PR scandals that pile on the external obstacles. But even in those moments, the film often redeems itself by snapping back to something intimate and grounded, a late-night conversation at the kitchen table, a small gesture of care, a sarcastic comment that breaks the tension. It's as if the movie occasionally gets a bit too excited about its own intrigue but then remembers, oh right, the heart of this story is these two people, and quickly recent us. Emotionally, oh, I would say the movie lands far more than it misses. There's a scene near the third act that, for me, is the emotional climax, even more than any big confrontation with the half-brother or the father. Luigi, overwhelmed by the weight of expectations and scared that he's dragging Sarah into a life she didn't ask for, breaks down, not in a loud explosion but in a kind of quiet, defeated confession. He tells her something along the lines of, "I thought marrying you would be a way to escape being the guy who got left, but now I'm afraid I'm going to be the guy who ruins your life too," and you can see how raw that insecurity is. This isn't just about his ex anymore, it's about his fear of being inherently inadequate, of being the common denominator in every bad thing that's happened. Sarah's response is where the film's whole philosophy about love comes into focus. She doesn't rush to contradict him with cheesy assurances that he's perfect or that love alone will fix everything. Instead, she sits with him in that pain for a moment, acknowledges the truth in what he's feeling, because he has made mistakes, he has been passive, he has let fear make choices for him, and then she says something like, "If my life gets ruined, let it be because of my own decision, not because I was too scared to choose." That line floored me because it reframes love not as something that happens to you, like a storm, but as a conscious, risky choice. She is essentially saying, "I am not your savior and you are not my project, I'm here because I choose you, knowing you imperfect, knowing this is complicated." That is a much more adult, nuanced take on romance than what we usually get in stories built around dramatic premises like contract marriages. There's a quiet courage in that kind of commitment that feels deeply resonant today, in a world where so many of us are understandably afraid of vulnerability, where it's easier to keep things, situationship, level than to go all in and risk actual heartbreak. And that's what makes Dinikahi Setelah Putus stand out in the crowded field of romantic dramas. It uses a high-concept setup, dumped at the altar, sudden marriage to a stranger, secret conglomerate heir, but it uses that setup to talk about very grounded, relatable anxieties. What do you do when the future you planned disintegrates? How much of your identity is tied up in the person you're with? Can you really start over, or are you just painting a new face on the same fears? The film doesn't give easy, one-size-fits-all answers, but it does give you scenes, images, and lines that you can carry with you, that might resonate at 2 a.m. when you're staring at your ceiling, thinking about your own past relationships or the expectations your family has placed on you. Watching it, I also couldn't help but think about how stories like this can influence the broader cultural conversation. In many societies, including Indonesia, there's still a very rigid script about the order of things: study, work, marry, have kids, and do it all within a certain timeline, or else you're seen as failing at adulthood. This movie doesn't outright reject that script. Luigi and Sarah do end up married, after all, but it complicates it by showing that the path to that marriage can be chaotic, non-linear, and that the meaning of marriage itself can be renegotiated. Their union starts as a transaction, morphs into a partnership, and then gradually becomes something heartfelt, and in that evolution, there's an implicit argument that what matters is not when you tick the box of married, but how and why you do it, and who you are while you're in it. For anyone who's ever felt left behind because their life didn't follow the expected timing, the person whose engagement broke, the person still single in their 30s, the person who chose career first, there's something quietly validating about a story that says, you can start again after the supposed finish line. And that's not a failure, it's part of the story too. Structurally, Dinikahi Setelah Putus is almost like a 3-act play. Act 1 is heartbreak and impulsive rebirth, Act 2 is adjustment and collision with the wider world, Act 3 is integration and choice. By the time you reach the end, you don't feel like everything is neatly tied up, and that's a compliment. You feel like you've watched two people move from survival mode into something more like living, from reacting to intentionally shaping their lives. Whether or not they get the company, whether or not Luigi reconciles fully with his father or his half-brother, feels secondary to the fact that he and Sarah have stopped lying to themselves, that they've stopped hiding behind convenience or cynicism. They've stood in front of each other, fully seen, and said, "I still want this." That's a rare kind of courage, on screen and off. So when the credits roll, what lingers isn't just the image of Luigi in a perfectly tailored suit or Sarah closing a deal in a glass-walled office, it's the memory of them in all their unguarded moments, laughing over burnt rice, arguing over boundaries, crying over old wounds, and sitting quietly on a balcony as the Jakarta skyline lights up around them, saying nothing but understanding everything. Dinikahi Setelah Putus might wear the clothes of a dramatic, glossy romance, but its soul is something far more tender, a meditation on how we rebuild after everything breaks, on how love isn't the opposite of pain but something that can grow in its shadow, and on how sometimes the bravest thing we can do is exactly what Luigi and Sarah learn to do: let someone new walk into the wreckage of our lives and help us build something that, while not perfect, is undeniably, beautifully real. And yet, there's another layer to why this story sticks, because once the initial shock wears off and you realize the show isn't going to let you sit comfortably in the fantasy of new wife saves broken man, what you're left with is something more unsettling and more honest: the way trauma makes you bargain with your own dignity, the way people confuse momentum for healing, and the way a family with too much money can turn love into a liability without even trying. One of the most effective tricks Dinikahi Setelah Putus pulls is how it changes the meaning of ordinary moments depending on who's watching. A simple handhold can feel romantic in private and political in public. A shared glance can be a confession in the kitchen and a press release at a gala, and that duality keeps you slightly on edge the entire time because you're trained to ask, is this intimacy, or is this strategy? And the genius is that sometimes it's both, sometimes the characters themselves don't know which one it is, and that confusion becomes the emotional reality of their marriage. Luigi, after being publicly abandoned, doesn't just lose a relationship, he loses certainty, and when certainty is gone, you start clinging to structure wherever you can find it. That's why the sudden marriage, as insane as it sounds, makes psychological sense, because a legal bond is a shortcut to structure. It's paperwork that pretends it can protect you from chaos. And Luigi is so desperate not to be the man standing alone at the altar again that he's willing to step into a new identity before he's ready, because readiness is a luxury he doesn't think he has anymore. Sarah's side of this is what makes the series feel sharper than it could have been, because she doesn't behave like someone swept away by romance, she behaves like someone who has made a decision, and as a viewer you keep scanning her for cracks, for any moment where the mask slips and you see what's underneath, and when those moments arrive they feel like tiny earthquakes, because the entire relationship is built on the assumption that she's in control, so any sign that she isn't becomes instantly intimate. And the show understands that intimacy isn't only about softness. Sometimes intimacy is the moment you see someone's fear, the moment you realize their confidence is armor, the moment you recognize that their competence is a way of not needing anyone. That's why Sarah's character can generate so many interpretations in the audience, because she embodies a very modern contradiction. She has power, but she's still vulnerable to being reduced to a rumor. She can command a room, but she can't command trust. She can propose marriage in a heartbeat, but she can't force someone to believe that proposal came from a place that isn't transactional. There's also something quietly devastating about how Luigi's newfound status doesn't feel like a promotion, it feels like an accusation, because once the conglomerate son truth is out in the air, every emotion he has becomes suspect to the people around him. If he's sad, they think he's weak; if he's angry, they think he's unstable; if he's kind, they think he's performing humility; and if he's silent, they think he's plotting. And that's the trap of privilege that the show actually captures. Well, when people believe you have everything, they refuse to believe you can feel anything honestly. The step-sibling conflict thrives in that environment because it doesn't require constant shouting. It can be carried by implication, by legal technicalities, by social positioning, by the kind of smile that says, "I'm family," while the eyes say, "I'm coming for your throat." And if you've ever been in a family where love is conditional and comparison is a sport, you recognize the emotional realism inside the melodrama. What hits hardest is the way the series keeps bringing Luigi back to that original humiliation as a reference point, because humiliation is a wound that teaches you lessons whether you want to learn them or not, and one of those lessons is this: never let yourself be seen as powerless again. So when Luigi steps into the power struggle, you're not just watching a plot development, you're watching a psychological response, and it makes the corporate battle feel like an extension of the romantic one, because both are ultimately about choice and control. Luigi was denied choice at the altar, and now the universe is daring him to reclaim it in the only arena where choice has consequences measured in millions. Sarah, meanwhile, becomes a kind of prism through which we see how women are treated differently in these spaces, because the moment she becomes Luigi's wife, she's either dismissed as decoration or feared as influence, but rarely respected as her own person. And the show squeezes tension out of that social reality by forcing her to navigate rooms where every compliment is a test and every question is bait. You can feel how exhausting it is to be constantly assessed, and that exhaustion gives her character depth beyond the surface glamour. She's not just a powerful director, she's someone who has had to earn power in a world that resents her for having it, and that resentment makes her sharper, and that sharpness makes her lonely, and that loneliness is the space where real love could potentially grow if she ever allows it. The romance, when it works, works because it's not always pretty, it's two people negotiating the terms of safety. Luigi wants reassurance but doesn't want to beg for it. Sarah wants closeness but doesn't want to surrender. They circle each other like they're both holding something fragile, and the fragility is not the marriage certificate, it's their pride. And pride, in this series, is both a shield and a poison, because pride can help you survive a hostile family, but it can also keep you from saying the one sentence that would save your relationship, "I'm scared." The show's emotional peaks tend to come from that withheld vulnerability, the moments when a character almost confesses and then swallows it, and you can practically feel the audience leaning forward, because confession is the currency of romantic payoff, and this story makes you earn it. In terms of cinematic texture, the contrast between spaces remains one of the most satisfying elements to imagine as you watch, the public spaces where everything is too bright and too clean, where laughter is measured and everyone stands at the correct distance from power, and the private spaces where the lighting feels softer and the air feels heavier, where the characters can finally be ugly with their emotions, where a silence can last long enough to actually mean something. A lot of dramas like this rely on big declarations, but Dinikahi Setelah Putus finds a lot of its bite in the smaller humiliations and the smaller kindnesses. A subtle dismissal at a family table can hurt more than a screaming match, and a quiet defense from a spouse can feel more romantic than a kiss, because it's not about passion in the abstract, it's about loyalty in public, and loyalty in public is the rarest kind when everyone is watching for weakness. The pacing, too, benefits from letting the viewer sit in uncertainty. Instead of constantly resolving every question, the show lets certain doubts linger across multiple scenes, which mirrors the way real trust builds, or fails to build, in a relationship that started too fast. You don't just flip a switch and believe someone. You collect evidence, you interpret tone, you replay conversations at night, you watch how they behave when they think you're not looking. Luigi does that with Sarah. Sarah does that with Luigi. And the viewer does it with both of them, which creates a kind of participatory tension. You're not only watching, you're investigating. That's why the series becomes easy to binge. Every episode, every stretch of story, feels like it's offering you another clue about who these people really are, and whether their marriage is becoming something genuine or simply becoming more complicated. And then there's the cultural element of the rebound marriage fantasy, because on paper it's outrageous, but emotionally it taps into a very common impulse. When you've been rejected, you want to prove you're still wanted. Luigi's decision to marry Sarah can be read as a way of clawing back dignity, a way of telling the world, you can't ruin me, I'm still chosen, but the tragedy is that this kind of proof never actually heals the original wound, it just covers it, and the series keeps testing whether Luigi will ever address the wound directly or whether he'll keep trying to outrun it with new roles, husband, heir, rival, corporate player, until he forgets the sound of his own feelings. Sarah's presence makes that test sharper because she is not just a person, she's a symbol of his recovery, and nobody likes being treated like a symbol, even when the symbolism comes with affection. So you get this subtle emotional conflict where Sarah may genuinely care for Luigi, but she also resents being his, after, his, replacement story, the proof that he can move on, because she wants to be chosen for herself, not as an antidote to someone else. When the series leans into that, it becomes more than melodrama, it becomes a story about how love can fail not because there isn't enough feeling, but because there isn't enough clarity. If you're watching for performances, this is where the actors would need to do their most delicate work, because the script is asking them to communicate what they are not saying. Luigi's grief has to exist under his attempts at strength, and Sarah's tenderness has to exist under her attempts at control. The best scenes in these kinds of stories are never the ones where someone says, I love you, they're the ones where someone could say it and doesn't, where you can see it in their body language, where their voice changes by half a note, where they choose to stand in front of someone else when a threat comes. That's the cinematic language of devotion, and Dinikahi Setelah Putus understands it well enough to keep the emotional tension simmering instead of boiling over too soon. And because the plot includes a fight for power against a step-sibling, the show also gets to explore legitimacy as an emotional theme, not just a legal one. Luigi isn't only fighting to inherit a company, is fighting to be considered real inside his own family, and Sarah, as an outsider who becomes an insider overnight, is fighting to be considered more than a convenient attachment. The step-sibling conflict naturally drags up questions about who deserves what, and those questions are never just about money. They are about recognition, about love that was given unevenly, about resentments that have been fermenting for years, about the quiet cruelty of being compared in a family that treats children like investments. When you watch those dynamics play out, you start to see why the show's premise isn't as ridiculous as it seems, because in a world like this, marriage actually is strategy. It always has been. And the only difference is that Luigi and Sarah are honest about the speed, while everyone else pretends their own alliances are pure. That's one of the more biting subtexts. The wealthy characters may judge Luigi's sudden marriage as scandalous, but many of them have built their entire lives on socially acceptable transactions. The show's title becomes almost ironic in that way, because being married after being dumped sounds chaotic, but compared to the calculated marriages in elite circles, Luigi and Sarah's bond might actually be the most emotionally truthful thing happening, even if it started in desperation. Audience reaction tends to spike around these moral ironies, because viewers love pointing out hypocrisy, and this show hands them plenty to chew on. Characters who preach family values while plotting betrayal, characters who criticize Sarah's boldness while benefiting from centuries of quiet manipulation, characters who act scandalized by impulsiveness while making ruthless decisions every day in Suits. And that hypocrisy fuels the satisfaction of watching Luigi, the supposed naive one, slowly learn the rules and decide which ones to follow and which ones to burn. If the series lands its later emotional beats, what you feel by the end isn't just, I shipped them, or, I hated the villain, it's something more complicated, a sense that both love and power can be inherited like a disease, and the only way to break the cycle is to choose differently even when it costs you. That's the kind of theme that gives a melodrama weight, because it turns the corporate fight into a question of identity, and it turns the romance into a question of ethics. Will Luigi become the kind of heir who wins by destroying everyone, or will he become the kind who refuses to let the family turn him into a weapon? Will Sarah remain someone who controls outcomes at any cost, or will she become someone who accepts that loving another person means accepting uncertainty, accepting the possibility of loss, accepting that you can't storyboard someone else's heart like a business plan? Those aren't small questions, and when a series built on a wild premise dares to ask them, it earns more respect than you might expect going in. So if you're sitting there wondering whether Dinikahi Setelah Putus is just a juicy, dramatic binge or something that will actually leave you thinking about your own relationships and your own definitions of dignity, the answer is that it can be both, and that's why it works. It gives you the cliffhanger energy, the scandal energy, the fantasy energy, but it also slips in an uncomfortable truth, that sometimes the hardest thing about being broken isn't the pain, it's the way pain makes you reachable, and in Luigi's world, being reachable is the same thing as being hunted, which is why his greatest victory isn't simply finding love again, it's learning to protect that love from becoming just another asset in a family's endless appetite.